Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about questions you should and should not ask in a job interview setting. Today, your Law School Toolbox host is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website, Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about questions you should and shouldn't ask in a job interview setting. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Well, we get a lot of questions about this, and we have covered these topics a little bit in different episodes, but we wanted to do one full episode on this. All right, so in any job interview, you're probably going to be asked at some point if you have questions for the interviewer. Is it ever okay to say no?
No, it's never okay.
That is the correct answer. It's never okay.
Yeah, it's more important to, come up with some boring questions than to say nothing.
Yeah, because if you say nothing, I mean, A, you're not really holding up your end of the conversation. And B, I mean, you have to have some questions, right? I mean, how could you possibly not have questions about this job you're considering taking or this person who's interviewing you? It just looks completely bizarre when someone just says, oh, no, I think I read the website and I'm good. Which I've had people do.
Yeah, I think it just shows sort of, right. And I think it just shows sort of a lack of interest or preparedness, that you didn't have this ready to go.
Right.
Because I've never really heard of an interview where someone didn't ask, do you have any questions at the end?
Well, it's just considered polite.
It's just to fill time too.
Yeah. I mean, it's just polite, if you're having this conversation with them and you want to make sure, okay, well, what questions do you have that I can help you with? It's not necessarily to put people on the spot.
Yeah, I think some of it is kind of, just part of the process. So I don't think you're going to discover anything earth-shattering, but you do need to do that at the end.
Right. You should be prepared. All right. Well, people often wonder, is it okay to ask the same question of different interviewers, or do they need to come up with completely unique questions for every person?
I think it's fine to ask the same questions. I think there should be some maybe that are sort of generic that you ask everybody, and then some that are more specific to the person. You looked at their background, you have something specific maybe about their practice. Or something like that. And then you sort of have the general one. So I would say maybe a few of each.
I think that's good advice. I mean, because typically speaking, people may not realize, but oftentimes if you're going into any type of job interview, you're going to know who you're talking to, whether it's at a firm or a nonprofit or whatnot. They're going to tell you like, oh, you're interviewing today with Alison Monahan. And you can go Google Alison Monahan and see what Alison Monahan has been working on, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And sometimes they'll even give you sort of their bios ahead of time. That being said, sometimes there are also like last minute searches, and usually the person knew, that you didn't know about them ahead of time. So that's totally fine too. Right.
And that's where your generic questions always come in handy. How many questions do you think is okay or good to ask in general? I mean, a couple, 10, like what's reasonable?
10 sounds like too much. I just kind of got nervous hearing 10.
I'm thinking, wow, we're going to be there a long time.
Yeah, I would say somewhere, in between. I think 2 or 3 is fine. Maybe you could have 5 if there's enough time for it. So maybe I'd prepare sort of up to 5 and then see, what fits and how much time you have.
I think that's right. I mean, sometimes you get these interviewers who really have not a lot to say. So if you've got to fill, say, 20 to 30 minutes of time and they're not really asking you questions, you need to have a bank of things you can pull on. So I think minimum, I would probably have at least like 4 to 5 prepared, but then only plan to kind of ask 2 or 3 of those.
That sounds perfect to me.
Well, I was a very good interviewee. I think sometimes what people don't realize is you've got to also be kind of gauging the room here. Does this person seem interested in answering questions? Great. Ask them more. Let them talk the whole time. They'll love it. Or do they seem really reluctant? You may have to like draw them out more. Do they seem bored? Maybe you shouldn't be asking so many things. Is your time running out? All of these things you kind of got to be gauging the room on to see like what's appropriate.
Absolutely. I think you should be in the moment, and there may be a question that comes up based on your conversation. You should be actually listening and being there in the interview and not just doing whatever you prepared.
Right. No, I think active listening is really key, because if somebody, say you ask someone, for example, like, oh, tell me what a typical day looks like for you. What kind of stuff are you working on right now? There are tons of follow-up questions in there. They're probably going to tell you about some case that they're doing or some deal that they're doing or some project that they're doing, and you want to be following up. Oh, that seems really interesting, so it's a real conversation.
Exactly. I don't think it's very good if you just, kind of like end that and just go to the next thing you prepared when it doesn't seem like it naturally flows in the conversation. So I think that's really important.
Right. Or it doesn't seem like you were listening because you just randomly switch topics, and they're like, oh, okay. Are you interested in this? Or are you just asking me some questions that you heard about on a podcast?
Right. Remember that the answers matter, and you're not just doing this to check a box and ask the questions.
Right. I mean, in theory, you should have some interest in learning more about this person and or the experience you might be signing up for. So I do think this is actually a good opportunity to learn something.
Exactly. And you can see sometimes it's, the way they answer it, how interested are they in what they do? All of that kind of stuff matters.
Yeah. Do they seem enthusiastic? I mean, I've definitely asked what I thought were fairly innocuous questions and had someone say, why don't you close the door for this one? And you're like, oh, sure. Okay, thanks. That's good information. And then they tell you something crazy. And you realize you probably don't want to work there. All right, well, let's talk generally about the type of questions that are okay and those that should be avoided. What are some good and bad general topics?
So I would say good is what you already mentioned, which is sort of what's a typical day like, maybe something about a recent deal or a recent case that you've seen in the news, that they got some good press about. You can ask them sort of how they got to where they are, their career trajectory. You could ask them, I think, sort of about the culture of the firm, the sort of general questions about that, I think are all kind of good areas to hit.
Right.
Bad areas would be, and we're talking about, a big law firm. I would say I wouldn't be asking about pro bono. I wouldn't be asking about anything negative that I'd heard in the news or anything that might be sort of like a hot button issue. I wouldn't be asking them about bonuses. So all those areas I think I would avoid.
Right. I think a good topic too that's general purpose that sometimes people ask us is sort of, what kind of characteristics do you think a successful person working here, like kind of at my level, would have? What are you guys kind of looking for? Who do you think succeeds typically in this role, that kind of thing? Because ideally then, A, what they're looking for and you can kind of tailor your answers to that. And B, it kind of gives them that shine of like, oh, I do want someone who's like smart and responsive. Maybe this person in front of me is those things.
I think that's great. Like, who do you want on your team as a junior associate? Right. What qualities?
Yeah, I just think it's one of those like halo questions that is rarely going to hurt you. And it also, it kind of tells you a little bit about the management style of the firm, because if you ask 3 different people that and none of them can come up with an answer, then maybe they haven't really thought about, why they're hiring the people they're hiring or what the firm culture really is.
Definitely. I think, you can learn a lot from even their sort of lack of answer.
Exactly. Well, you touched on this briefly. Let's follow up on it. What if the organization that you're interviewing at has been in the news for maybe less than great reasons recently? So things like sexual harassment, racial issues, like lawyers behaving badly. Is it ever okay to kind of ask about this stuff?
I personally don't think so in this setting, in this interview setting. Like that is stuff you can find out, I think in a more like behind the scenes way, in terms of, if you happen to know someone, if you know someone that knows someone, that sort of thing. And I think you should be doing your own research, and you can take that into account when you're making a decision about where you want to work. But I think putting someone on the spot in an interview and making them uncomfortable about something that's happened, like more generally at the place they work, it's just not the time.
Right. I think one thing to keep in mind too is what we're really talking about here are these pre-offer interviews. You're going into like a first round interview or second round interview. Generally speaking, if you want to, you're going to have the opportunity after you have an offer to have a second set of interviews with people. And I think, if there are things you're really concerned about that you can't, for whatever reason, get information on, I think, that may be an appropriate place to ask before you accept an offer, but definitely not before you have the offer.
Absolutely. It's a completely different ballgame after you have the offer.
Right. I mean, they're not going to
be much more open to asking different kinds of real questions, and you can kind of go to a different place then. I still don't think it's a good idea to make someone uncomfortable after, but I think you can ask more real questions, and sort of about, their experiences, with this issue or whatever it is. But at this point, you're putting your best foot forward. You're trying to get the offer. The goal is always to get an offer, even if, you don't necessarily think it's probably the place you want to work. You still want to get the offer.
Right. I mean, if you're bothering to do the interview, you may as well try to get the offer.
Exactly.
Yeah. And, I think it's valid if there are things that would prevent you from working there unless you got them clarified, then of course you want to ask about them at some point, just not immediately.
And it's sort of like if something is so bad that you wouldn't even consider it, you don't even need the more information, then you shouldn't be in the interview. Like you shouldn't be taking a spot is
right.
what I would say too. It's just like you've heard this and it's a deal breaker.
Yeah, exactly. Or like you've seen the lawsuit, you've seen the filing on Above the Law. You're like, maybe I don't want to work in this place, which is totally valid. Well, what about financial topics, like how the organization is doing? Are those sort of things okay ever to ask?
I think this depends on the way you're asking it and sort of what you're asking, and also what the organization is. I think it's different, a law firm than, a company, a nonprofit, something like that, where their financials might be, more relevant, or more public. I think in terms of a law firm, I just think you have to tread lightly on this kind of situation. If there's just been layoffs or something like that, I think you have to think about, if what happened, what are you getting out of discussing it more? And I think this might be more of a conversation for after the offer also.
I agree. I mean, I've occasionally had partner friends who, for whatever reason, really like it when people ask them stuff about like how the firm's doing. But generally speaking, I think it's a risky area to go into. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And not all of it is going to be, public and is going to be really obvious. And there's kind of a move away from this like profits per partner, margin. I think it's completely misleading anyway.
Oh, for sure.
It doesn't really mean anything. I think you could ask now, what are the like busy practice areas, something like that, what's been doing well,
right?
Not like in a really specific, like financial way.
Yeah, I think another fair question at this point would be generally, and putting a positive spin on it is, what kind of decisions has the firm made or actions have they taken in response to the pandemic that have worked out well, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Just focus on the things that they've done, that are doing well and not like, what's tanking right now.
Right. Or like, how horrible is it to work from home? I think always put a positive spin on it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So what are some always good questions to have on hand? We've touched on this a little bit, but let's give people our like 4 or 5 questions we think that you could always ask.
So I think the idea, I mean, obviously, is what we've said, if there's specific stuff you want to find out about, you should have those questions. If they're genuine questions you want to know the answer to. I think always good questions are questions where honestly you're flattering the person that you're asking and they're going to be talking about themselves. I think is like always a good idea. Lawyers really like to talk about themselves and they're going to feel like it went well.
So let's formulate a question. So for example, in that scenario, I would typically ask someone maybe something like, oh, how did you get into this? How did you start working in the area that you're working in? Something like that.
And if you've been able to look at their background and can even ask something more specific, like, oh, I saw that you transitioned from X to Y,
right?
Or whatever it was, I think it's absolutely fine to get specific about something like that. Like, oh, you made this career change, or, you went from this to this. How did that happen? I think it's always a good question.
Right. Yeah, and I think, if it is something you could just look up, you don't really want to bring that up because you could just look it up if you're not going to use it. But I think getting into people's like kind of mental state is always good because you can't just look that up on the website. Like, oh, it looks like you've been working in bankruptcy. That seems like a really interesting area. What motivated you to go into that?
Exactly. And a lot of times you're going to be given interviews with people that do have something in common with you. So it may make a lot of sense,
right?
That's why you got put together. I always like the question of what is a typical day? And there may not be a typical day, but something like that so they can go through kind of what they do.
Yeah, I always like that
in a real world sense. Yeah, I think people like to talk about that.
Well, and also there you get interesting information because if you're talking to 4 or 5 different people and you ask them all, like, what does a typical day look like for you? Of course, understanding probably no day is typical. Ha, ha, ha. But then you do find out, like, what do people spend their time on?
Exactly. I think it'd be interesting now to ask how they've managed, the pandemic, working from home. What's the transition like? I feel like people probably want to talk about that.
Yeah, oh, what are some upsides of like this crazy time we're living in now that you guys are all working remotely? Like, how's that going?
Yeah. Do you expect it to continue? Has it been, easier in some ways, things like that,
right.
And they may then follow up and ask you about what it's been like to, do remote classes or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think you can always have a go-to of like, what type of person do you think really succeeds in this role? Like, what are you guys looking for? I think that's 4. Anything else?
I do really like something specific that's current. So this may not always be, make sense, but if there's any way that you can find something that they've recently been working on or has been big at the firm, I think it's good to ask about that and shows that's the one kind of like research piece you could actually take the initiative on. And I think people like that.
Yeah, I think as long as, it's something publicly available that's very obvious, great topic. I disagree a little bit about the pro bono. Like, I don't think you should go into great detail on that, but it is something that I would sometimes throw in if we like really needed to kill some time. And I think you could phrase it like, oh, I know the firm has a commitment to pro bono, and are there any projects you've been working on or that you know of that seem interesting? Something like that. If they have been doing something, I don't think you can really get in great detail on this because the reality is this is a business, but I don't know.
I guess it depends on the firm, right? Like, do they actively advertise that that's a big deal for them?
Right.
Are they trying, and I guess a lot of firms do at this point. So I think you're right. My concern is that students sometimes will not understand that it's not something they should focus on.
Right. Which I definitely agree with. This is not how you make money.
That's my concern, that like you might take it too far. And so just don't even go there. But I agree that you can ask. And it usually is important to a lot of attorneys that they do some pro bono work. And so they may appreciate it. But my concern is that they may not appreciate it to the point that you appreciate all the work that you've been doing to volunteer and to whatever. And then it gives the impression that that's the direction that you want to head in your career.
No, I mean, I definitely at one point asked someone that, again, like just fairly generally. And he literally was like, well, if that's a real concern for you, I think this is probably not the right place.
Which is actually a good thing to find out in an interview
yeah.
if it is something that's important to you. So that's where the question exactly would be good.
Yeah. And also, that was good information. All right. Well, what are some topics or questions that you've heard of students asking that just make you cringe?
Well, like I said, going too much into the I want to do public interest work area is a really big mistake if you're applying to a big law firm. They're a for-profit organization, even though pro bono is important. I think you just need to be careful. That's like not what you're getting into. Other things, I remember specific issues that came up where like a student did a crazy amount of research on the interviewer and asked like really specific things that were not obviously publicly available or like weren't on their bio or professional sites, that they clearly, gone into like personal social media, things like that, which really like weirded out the interviewer. And was totally inappropriate. So I think that's a bad topic. Like we said, anything that's sort of uncomfortable, going to make the person feel weird. There was like a lawsuit. There's something really bad going on. Your friend just got laid off. Whatever it is, it's like not the time to bring it up. So I think you just want to keep the topics kind of neutral.
I agree. I mean, I've had people ask me sort of all of those type of questions or do those things, and it is very weird as an interviewer. I mean, I've had people bring things up that, I hadn't thought about for years that were somewhere on the internet, and it's just like, that's a little creepy. I've had people ask about like, well, I've heard this firm is really notorious for sexual harassment. Okay, why are you interviewing here then? I mean, bad questions I personally have asked and kind of stuck my foot in. I mean, and again, like you just don't know sometimes. Like the pro bono one is generally fairly innocuous, not always. I remember one time, I can't remember if I had asked to talk to someone who was like a mother or if they had just set me up with this because I was a woman. But, it was explicit that this was the interview where I was supposed to talk to them about like balancing work life and family. And I don't even really remember how that was explicit, but it was made fairly explicit. So, I asked this person like, oh, I see that you have like a new baby and a toddler. Like, how is that working out? That was one of the close the door ones.
Yeah.
Like, don't work here. I actually, in that case, she literally said, don't take an offer. But again, I mean, maybe that was a good thing. I don't know, but I think you just have to tread really carefully around any of these topics that could potentially be sensitive for people.
Exactly. Because I think it's sort of like, the interviewers are trained on things that they are and aren't allowed to ask you, but students may not realize, the opposite, like things that they shouldn't be asking the interviewer either.
Right. Oh, well, that's a whole other bucket we haven't even thought about because it would just never really occur to me. Let's talk about that. What type of things in that bucket should students not be asking about?
Well, I would say sort of the same things that I would say the people I was training on interviewing, which is like, asking people where they're from is like actually an illegal question. And people don't realize that because they're thinking, oh, I'm just saying like, it looks like you're from Ohio and so am I. But it implies things about, race and, maybe a country of origin. It implies a lot of things that people can read into it that you don't mean when you say it.
Right.
So I would be careful. Same with asking them about their family. My understanding is that interviewees can bring things up about themselves, and then the interviewer can ask you if you've said like, I have children, that they can ask you. But I feel like, the same thing. Don't bring it up unless they brought it up with you.
Right, which they shouldn't be bringing it up with you anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, anything that remotely touches on any type of immutable characteristic, you should not touch with a 10-foot pole in an interview. So, if you want to say, for example, like you notice that both of you, went to the same university in Ohio, that is a different scenario than like, oh, I'm from Ohio. Are you from Ohio? No, you don't discuss that. What you discuss is, oh, I see that you were also, an Ohio State undergrad. Like, go, I don't know, Buckeyes, whatever they are. That type of thing is okay. I mean, and I think, you can find some commonalities, but you do really need to think about what the implications are of what you're asking people.
That's exactly what I think, because I don't think that anyone really means it in a way that it can come across. Like, I don't think there's any, malice in probably most of these sort of questions. I wouldn't bring up politics.
Oh, God, no.
Kind of all of those hot button issues that you wouldn't bring up in any sort of professional setting because it might create a problem.
Yeah, I think sometimes people occasionally get in trouble because they start commenting on things in the office. So, you have a picture of your children. Like, how old are they? Just don't go there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, people think they're just thinking of things to say. That's why I would come up with some sort of like totally neutral, even like pop culture topics. I think we've talked about this before. Mm-hmm. Like, there was this big sports event, or there was the Oscars, or something that, can be kind of neutral.
Right. Or even like, what are you watching on Netflix, that is very neutral. Like, oh, I mean, if you really need to kill some time, I mean, your go-tos are going to be some type of follow-up question. Oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. That is a classic therapist question. They can kill tons of time with that one. But you can also have kind of in your back pocket, I've been watching the Great British Bake Off or baking show. That seems pretty innocuous to me. Like if I need to kill some time, it's on my resume that I like to bake sourdough bread, and then, we've got 5 minutes left. Nobody has anything to say. Like, what have you been watching lately? I've been watching the Great British Bake Off. It's so great. You can definitely kill time on that.
Or like pandemic activities, I guess, right now. People have like new hobbies, things like that.
Yeah, you got to be careful on that one too, because you don't want to say you're doing something that they think is inappropriate.
Right. That's why I was thinking like sourdough bread, like you said, or like coloring, or I've been learning X activity or something like that. I guess you do have to be careful that you're not doing anything that like anyone could have an issue with right now.
Right, exactly. So I think you just want to think through these things before you plan to bring them up. And you do,
Like I was even thinking right now, like you wouldn't, like normally in this situation, you'd be like, how was your holiday?
Right.
But I think I wouldn't even say that now because something bad could come out of it.
Right. And also like you shouldn't have been doing anything for your holiday anyway. So,
right.
And, things like travel plans, like, could be a topic normal times, not good topics now.
Yeah. So some of these like questions that I would normally say, like, how was your weekend? I might not say given this situation.
Right. Although that's also a classic not to ask anyone ever in a law firm because you just assume their weekend was terrible. But
good point.
Yeah. So there's some weird things that you could run into that seem innocuous. So, I think you just want to be kind of cognizant of the way that some of this could be coming off, and then just have prepared these like very neutral questions that you can ask to anyone.
Absolutely. And I don't want to scare people off that like everything is like a landmine. Cause I know some of this might sound like that. But I think the idea is just what you said, just prepare, think about, what the other person might view, maybe run these questions by some other people in your life who are like different, like a variety of people, and make sure that no one kind of sees any issue with them. I think might be a good idea. I think right now we're in a situation where more things are off limits than they normally would be, is what I would say.
That is definitely true. All right. And like I said earlier, just remember you can always ask or generally ask for a follow-up interview with people after you have an offer. So this is where you can use, that time for any pointed questions, things you really do want to know, but you feel like probably are not going to help you get that offer necessarily.
Absolutely. And I promise that you can do that. Like they expect you to, they actually really appreciate that you do it, that you're interested enough that you want to find out more. I always liked that, as the recruiter, that the, student had more follow-up questions. So just save them.
Oh, and the other thing you should never ask about in an initial interview, but you can ask about in this follow-up is how many hours people are billing.
Yes, that is a huge issue. And it could go either way, right? Like they're billing so much and they're overworked, or they're not billing enough and they're worried about it.
Yeah, I would not touch anything like that in an initial interview round.
And like I said, with the bonuses,
yeah,
I think that sort of ties in if you've heard anything.
Well, the bonus stuff you can get information on, like that's online.
Absolutely. And the thing I would keep in mind is like there might be something, you know, we talked about active listening. There might be something that comes up like in an interview or they asked you about that you could maybe follow up on. And that's something you could put into like a thank you note or something like that. So if there's something where you could actually do something and get back to them with some more information, I think that makes like a great impression.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, just tread lightly, but don't be too scared, I guess, is my final thought. Any final thoughts you have?
I agree. You know, there's a fine line, but I think that, you know, you can absolutely hit the right tone if you just do some prep.
Right. I think just, you know, upbeat, not too controversial, but have some questions. That's what you're going for.
And listen to the answer.
Exactly. Listen to the answer. And if there's like a follow-up, you may as well follow up rather than just asking your next question, because you got to get through the 30 minutes.
Exactly.
All right. Well, speaking of that, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, including writing some questions for you, check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.